let's try. I have a terrible feeling this is going to pull down my skirt in an awkward fashion. In which case, could someone signal me from the crowd? Oh, this is a tough crowd.
Can I introduce you?
Oh, please, thank you.
Good morning again. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Sandra Swart. Some of you may remember a few years ago, just 3 or 4 years ago, she gave a course, a timely course on horses in war. I remember it being totally upsetting. We are very pleased that she is back. I came across Professor Swart reading an article that she had written about the history of
Oh, so you're the one.
I'm the one. I'm the guilty person, and I thought this is what we need to have. Now, she's given me a terribly modest CV, so I want to awfully much, except that she has achieved something very, what should I say? It's just absolutely incredible that she did this. She's a professor of history at Stellenbosch University, and she simultaneously completed an MSc in environmental change and a DPhil in modern history arts. She recently completed a degree as president of the Southern African Historical Society. She's interested in social and environmental paradigms, focusing on the interaction of humans and other animals. Her most recent book is Riding High: Horses, Humans, and History in South Africa. Please welcome Professor Swart.
I just want to apologize from the heart for being a little late. It is incredibly unlike me. I don't know how to, perhaps my sound man will address this issue. Is this better? Perhaps if I speak awkwardly thusly. Is that better? Okay. Perhaps shall I hold it? Okay. How's this? I'll just hold it, it's fine. So yeah, a huge apology for being late. I did get into my car and leave Stellenbosch at 6:30 this morning. So it has been quite, I do not wish to be a prima donna, but it was quite something. But it is a great, great pleasure to be here. I love summer school. I get far more out of it than you do. No, really. It is a rare treat to have an audience who wishes to be there. It is very special for an academic to have people who pay good cash dollar money and give up their time to come listen to our research. And I love the course I gave a few years ago on the history. It was called The World the Horses Made, the Global Forces Equine Input. And it went down very, very well. On the evaluation forms, people were very kind, except for one guy who said there was far too much about horses in it. So, alas, there will be animals in this talk, and, leave now if that wasn't what you were hoping for. But it is, I'm very excited to share this research because you're the first people I'm springing it on. And I don't really know why it is, because I finished the research about a year ago. And for a complicated set of reasons, I felt incredibly uncomfortable about actually releasing this in the cold, shark-filled waters of academe. So what I would like from you is to be as critical as possible today and try to pinpoint any glaring errors and omissions, as well as perhaps just giving me really candid feedback, because it is time for me to bite the bullet and allow this little runt to go to boarding school and live in the wider world. But when I tell you the story, you will see perhaps why I have been sitting on it. And that is because I'm a grizzled, hard-bitten historian who only does objective, detached facts. And I wasn't able to do this time, and you'll see why. You'll see why. So I'm feeling, I'm sort of coming out the closet here as being not so detached. And it's a very uncomfortable place to be. This is a strange liminal border area where feral historians roam. And I hope you'll just bear with me and just give me feedback. Be honest. Okay. So in 2000, and also I won't be deviating too much from the script because I want to give it as a paper. Then you see how it is. I won't just extemporize or do back of an envelope talk. I want to give you the paper. Okay. So it's a little bit like when Bob Dylan went electric. A lot of you will feel betrayed by this, but I have to do it. So we go to 2012. On a tour of his rural dominions, our president, Jacob Zuma, in dispensing his annual Christmas gifts and wisdom, warned his people that loving a dog was merely mimicking white people and showed that one suffered from a lack of humanity, especially if one walked one's dog or took them to a vet. Indeed, he declared it a rejection of African traditions and values. The internet erupted. Social media was inundated with photos of black men and their dogs. Especially, of course, the Trump card, Nelson Mandela with a Rhodesian Ridgeback. All my friends posted that. President Zuma was very surprised at this outburst. When you think of what he gets away with, why were we going nuts about this? So his spin doctors went into damage control mode. They explained that President Zuma had been trying to decolonize the African mind. So, what was really happening here? What was going on here? There is, I think, and I wonder if you'll agree, there is a deep ambivalence about dogs in South Africa historically. There's a strangeness in the relationship between dogs and humans between humans and humans over dogs. What I'm currently working on is exploring the history of that strangeness, and particularly through the lens of the police dog. To understand this ambivalence, the police dogs were creatures poised between citizenry and state, between technology and sentience, between being a living, breathing creature that thinks for itself, between agency, operating on its own 2 feet or 4 feet, and training, between those 2 points. And also, I'll show you the police dog was poised between good and evil, and always between nose and teeth. So using archival sources, ethnographic material, my project is to track the long history of dogs in South Africa, particularly in law enforcement. And it includes the lives of a few dogs. You'll learn about dogs called Bosco, Milan, Maxim, Flash, Killer, and Sour, particularly Sour, to explore how dogs have been very differently deployed over time, how their role has shifted. It asks questions about the mutable, the changeable role of dogs in forensic detection, and discusses contemporaneous understandings and also terrible misunderstandings of what a dog can do. It thereby explores the tension between the idea of the dog as merely an instrument of scent and the dog as a sentient individual. So I follow where the dog's nose leads humans forensically, but also politically in the long 20th century. And in doing that, I'll be looking at history from a lot closer to the ground than usual. But of course, the political is also the personal. And I wrote this paper at what I think was, well, during possibly the worst year I've experienced. 2016 was really quite something. If you speak to any academic who lived through that, people were unsettled, they were disconcerted, they were anxious. The universities no longer seemed to be the safe space they had been for intellectual discussion, for debate, even robust debate. Things were changing, academics were. It was uncanny, a strange space for us. And also, to make it even more personal, my beloved Rhodesian Ridgeback Mojo had given birth to 11 puppies, which was my experience of motherhood. Although my sister says that I must stop saying that. She's had an actual human baby. She gets very angry if I refer to that as my experience of motherhood. But it was. I was rearing these 11 puppies in my bedroom with me. We were co-mothering, Mojo and I. She would wake up at 2 a.m., she'd deal with it. At 3 a.m., they'd start screaming again. She'd look at me like, Sandra, it's your turn. So it really, for me, it was an inundation. It was intense. I didn't sleep for 3 months. And I reared them like in my bedroom. And I was profoundly struck by the first 3 weeks of a dog's life being solely determined by their sense of smell. Safety, food, comfort was only obtainable by smelling it out. And dogs smell the world long before they see it and feel it. It's deeply disorienting and disturbing for a visual and oral creature like a human or a historian. And it was a salient reminder to me that the historiographic affective turn, which looks at the emotions, the senses, which really still requires our engagement as South African historians, we haven't looked at it. We don't look at the visceral, the bodily, what is felt, what is experienced. So I'm trying to write that into the kind of history I'm trying to put together. So I hope you'll forgive me the self-indulgence that's also a thread in the story I tell today, in the background, the story of Mojo. But it wasn't just that. It was also a time, I don't know if you remember, of two awful crimes against women. One happened in the leafy suburbs. There was a young girl jogging. Do you remember that? And the trial is still carrying on, but it really upset me. And at the same time, a girl a little bit older than her, young girl in the township, remember as well, at the same time. And it struck me again, this incredible violence we live with in this country. Really, well, I can't express it better than saying a few years ago I went to Outer Mongolia to do some of my horse work. I hired some horses, I got some horsemen. They weren't Kazakhs, luckily, but they were tough. They were hard-bitten men. And we rode in the footsteps Genghis Khan had ridden as a young man up near the border with Russia, up in the tundra. And we're 3 days' ride from anyone else, and it's bear and wolf country, and there's brucellosis in the rivers. I also fell into quicksand. And it was only when I got back to Oliver Tambo Airport that I felt scared again. So to me, that tells you we're living in a state of fear a lot of the time. So I was writing this and I was thinking about fear and about being a citizen in a country where you feel this anxiety and fear and what it does. So these are also threads in the story. So I wanted to keep one of the puppies out of the 11th, and I was torn between two. Zenith, who was a dog of size and swagger, biggest dog in the litter. Tough cookie, opened his eyes first, took on his mom, grabbed her by the muzzle. This was a dog that could protect you. But my heart was also taken by a dog called Rio, who was an awkward, nervous little puppy, but she embraced the world with a warmth and curiosity. So I was torn between these two dogs as I'm writing this paper. So then I immersed myself in the work. I went back to the archives in Pretoria and I looked at the first court cases on using dogs and starting the South African Police Service's dog service. I looked at over 1,000 pages in the archives, hundreds upon hundreds of court cases. And then reading the daily updates with the two terrible and emblematic crimes against women, living with this little pack of puppies, 13 dogs all day, every day. That was the basis of this. But to return to the historical record, how did dogs become signifiers of anxieties and stereotypes that whites and blacks in this country have of each other, especially the fear of which so many of my witnesses in the newspaper reports spoke about, especially this fear, the African fear of the white dog, and particularly the terror of the police dog. And here I should say something about violence and viscerality. South African history should come with its own trigger warning. You know how the students want you to do trigger warnings? My feeling is every year at the beginning of the year, I should just say, I'm a historian who talks about South African history. Every lecture should contain a trigger warning. It's tough, so consider yourself warned. Things will be shown, things will be talked about that are hard, but we just have to go through that. So I started going through the 7 volumes also of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there are scores of references to dogs. Dogs appear as part of the narrative of apartheid's oppression, as powerful instruments, but also agents, almost tools with brains, of the technocratic apartheid state. It's everywhere in the Truth Commission. As Kanya Bajamba said, and I'm quoting, dogs are just relics of a complicated history. They were complicit in the apartheid agenda. The breed of choice, the German Shepherd, had a special appetite for black African flesh. Anti-apartheid, oh, that was me and the puppies. No. Look at that. No, don't get distracted. We're going to do some hardcore history now. No. Okay. I know, but no, but now we must do serious stuff. Okay. Anti-apartheid and struggle activist Willie Bester's 2001 exhibition used dogs as a metaphor, a blunt refusal to erase the past horror of racial injustice. The articulation of his police dogs' bolted joints, the heavy weight of their bones, and the jagged perfection of their teeth suggest the brute power of the apartheid state. Bester was referencing and depicting at that gallery a disturbing incident from 1998. And that, of course, was 4 years after the official fall of apartheid. What happened was white South African policemen used 3 immigrants from Mozambique, do you remember this, as live bait on which to train their dogs. They videoed it and are shown laughing while their dogs attack. This appeared on SABC News. And of course it appeared internationally. This is 4 years after the fall of apartheid. It outraged a nation deeply ashamed and angry about its past, and it sharpened debate on how to reform the police itself. Because other things were going on. Dogs were disobeying their handlers, dogs were savaging suspects, dogs were having to be kept in cages, not being socialized with either humans or other dogs. In 2000, when the Mozambique refugee abuse case broke nationally and of course internationally, an international police dog trainer, Hans Schegel of the Swiss Canine Training School, came out and said that police dog training in South Africa was rotten to the core. He said the dogs themselves were too psychologically sick to be rehabilitated. He said, and I'm quoting, "They are trained on fear, so they have no trust in human beings." His argument was that it was based on a racist program predicated on the fear of dogs by Africans. And he said it was 50 years behind Europe. He maintained that the South African police needed a new breed of human dog handler, and he said they needed new puppies. His argument was that the existing core of police dogs should simply be killed so that we could start fresh with a generation of dogs that had never known apartheid. Now, to understand what happened here, we need to go back 100 years. I know I sound like a historian when I say that, but damn it, we need to go back 100 years to really understand what was going on when he said we need to kill the police dogs. We need to go back a century to know what happened. We need to go back to the very start of the South African police force in 1911, just after South Africa became independent from Britain. The various arms of police were amalgamated into one body, and one of the first tentative steps was the Great Experiment, as the police knew it, the Great Experiment, which was including dogs in detection. They had been used in Natal very, very briefly, but there was one bloodhound that was used, and he was terrible at his job. He never found anyone. So it had been kind of abandoned. And the first dog was actually called Rex. Now, at the opening of the brand new police dog program in 1912, there were only 13 dogs, or really 5 dogs and 8 puppies. The police set up a training facility in Irene in Pretoria, in the woods of Jan Smuts's farm. And the idea was to train the dogs at this central base, and then send the trained dogs, operating always in pairs, to be stationed in the rural districts. They'd be trained centrally in Pretoria and Jan Smuts's farm, and then be sent out to the rural districts. And a dog keeper had to be trained with that pair of dogs. So a particular dog keeper, a human, would be always sent out with the same 2 dogs. So it would be a little triumvirate operating together. And the first dog master was a guy called Cornelius Kuiper, who, I wanted to show you this, just the evocative images of hard to see, but it's everywhere. I could have chosen a million other pictures. But let's now, this is where we are now. Cornelius Kuiper, the dog master, 1912. And he was an expat from Holland who came out after the Anglo-Boer War. And he wasn't a young man, he was in his 50s, but he had a curious, dogged obsession. The man really wanted this to happen. And it's one of those examples where one individual drives a large part of this tiny microcosmic history. It wasn't just big macro forces. It was this one dude and his passion. He wanted a dog unit. And he never quit. The paperwork I've read fills my study, and most of it's letters from him. So 2 years into the program, there were 6 dogs. They had imported them from Holland at the cost of £300, which is an astonishingly high amount. Really, for some departments, that would be their yearly budget. In those 2 years, they were called out in 47 cases, which is once every 2 weeks, successful in 27, and convictions in only 6 cases, so 12% conviction rate. But over time, they developed a 12-month intensive training program, beginning for each puppy when they were 4 months old. And the emphasis was on teaching obedience, the climbing of obstacles, the jumping through windows, retrievals. The point was to get them thinking. And the point was to get a dog whose sole job was an aid in detection. They just wanted an intelligent nose. That's all they wanted. After the basics were in place, the dog was trained to follow human scent only. As Cornelius Caper, the dog master, explained, the dog picks out with almost uncanny accuracy one person whose scent has been given from an identification line of 6 to 10 people. He was taught to run from one end of the line to the other, and only on the return trip pick out his man by standing on his hind legs with the forepaws on the culprit's shoulders and barking until called off by the dog keeper. Please bear in mind, remember what the process was there. Run back and forth. I'm going to come back to this. So run back and forth along the line, then go to the one suspect, go behind, touch them. And that's going to be important. I'll tell you why in a minute. By the start of the 1920s, they had 65 tracker dogs who caught 104 criminals that year. By 1922, 73 dogs. 1928, 200 dogs. And they kept on buying good dogs from Holland. And then they started breeding their own in the delightfully named Kwaggaspoort, where it moved the dog unit moved in 1923, where it still is today. In fact, the newly minted Union government became heavily involved in the sex life of dogs on a ministerial level. In 1912, for example, the Secretary for Justice was told that police bitch Bosco, this is the Minister for Justice is reading this, was expecting her first litter of puppies, and so she had to be excused from active service. Minister had to okay it. The dog master judged by her bulging tummy that the litter would be large, and the minister had to respond to this. So Bosco. But it was on that kind of level because actually they were investing a lot of money in this, and it was a sign of modernity for the newly minted Union government. This kind of detail is ethnographic gold. And we know quite a lot, actually, because being the police, there was so much paperwork. We know about the early experiments conducted to get the best breed to use. They tried all sorts. Dobermans, Rottweilers, German Shepherds, Pointers, and also Rhodesian Ridgebacks, which had only been declared a breed in 1922. Finally, this dogmaster Caper decided he had perfected the recipe. The recipe was Doberman Pinscher with a dash of Rottweiler. It must be a quarter Rottweiler. So it settled the Doberman and made them more reliable in identity parades. And interesting, there was no perceived difference between male and female dogs, and all the dogs were kept intact because they wanted to further the breeding program. So Caper was particularly impressed by a Rottweiler called Max von Strahlenberg, and he wrote in an official report, "My heart beats with pleasure when I read of this dog's talents." And so then he purchased Flora, who was pregnant with Max's puppies, and brought her from Holland to South Africa. It's on this crazy level of detail, which one doesn't normally find, but because it's the cops, they write everything down in triplicate. So nice for historians. So by 1916, we had Maxwell and Queen, 2 Rottweilers. One significant case involving the new Rottweilers. It was one of those sort of iconic cases that raised what was happening in the dog unit to public awareness, brought in 3 dogs, De Wet, Maxwell, and Queen. It's not often you hear De Wet and the Queen operating so nicely together, but they did for this particular case. They tracked for several miles. They found an African man's murderer up in the mines in Joburg, and questioned by the detectives in their own language. And I want to remind you of the process of identifying the witness. You'll see why in a little while, why it's so important. They lined up with the three others. Maxwell was given the scent of the iron bar that had hit the victim. He was allowed to point out which of the African men he suspected. Here the detective noted, Maxwell did not doubt for a minute. He passed the first four smelling and barked at the same guy again. The constable noted it being a murder case. In my opinion, it was necessary to prove that the dog would not point out another man, so he repeated the scent trail. And Maxwell did it again, and then it was corroborated by the other two dogs. And that is quite important. Interestingly, the dogs get named in the police reports, but the suspects, and in this case, the police constables, were not. So, Bosco, back from motherhood, she resumed her career. She put motherhood behind her, she rejoined active duty, and she was used on a very famous murder case in Stellenbosch in 1922, which is also in the outlying rural districts. She, and only on Bosco's testimony, put away a man for 7 years hard labor. They didn't have any other clues. This is a bit of a problem, and we'll come back to that. Having gone through the criminal cases, I can tell you there's a surprising number of confessions. I would actually say to you about 90% of the people, once they were caught, confessed. Now, were we naive, we would say, well done, Bosco. But I think there are three reasons to consider why we must be skeptical. Okay, the first reason, the impact of forensic science. Look, the dogs were doing incredible stuff. They tracked from 200 yards to 6 miles. They tracked from scent that was 8 hours old to scent that was 30 hours old. And certainly there was a strong sense of excitement from the police themselves, which bursts through the bureaucratic language of their reports. There's a sense of wonder. And perhaps to the alleged perpetrators, it simply seemed pointless to defy this new science. Certainly the Commissioner of Police, Truter, believed that, and he specifically said this, Black Africans were so impressed by this uncanny knowledge possessed by the dogs that they spontaneously confessed to their crimes. Now, this brings me to the second point. If the police themselves were convinced by the power of smell, confessions may have been extracted by violence. If the police were entirely convinced by the dogs, it may have been that they were bringing their own level of force to their confessions, a technique certainly not unknown to the South African police. A third reason was suggested contemporaneously at the same time by top-level Commissioner Truter and by the dog master themselves. And the third reason was witchcraft. And that is, look, certainly as early as 1913, the dogmaster Kuiper said the moral effect has been very great among the natives who call them witch dogs. And it may be that the dogs were becoming a metonym, a metaphor, if you will, for the occult art of smelling. And it must be clearly understood how alive witchcraft was at the turn of the century. We know it's alive now. My father used to track the witchcraft killings up in Limpopo. It was a hobby of his. And he would say at least every month a witch is killed in this country now, today. But at the turn of the century, witchcraft was alive. In the 1920s, it was pandemic, in fact. Remember, it was a time of great social dislocation, political conquest, land dispossession of the African majority following the 1913 Land Act. And it was also a time of disease, of rinderpest and influenza. It was a time of great anxiety. And of course, indigenous healing practices were misunderstood and outlawed by the colonial authorities through the 19th century, and then by the state in the 20th century. And the authorities ruthlessly attacked the Isangoma under the witchcraft suppression laws of 1910 and 1957. These laws drove a wedge between black and white communities. Africans were arguing that the colonial state had actually aligned itself with the witches. On the other side, because remember they were suppressing witchcraft crimes, so it seemed as though they had taken the side of the witches. And on the other side, the state used witchcraft as proof of the irrational nature of Africans, which seemed to buttress the need for the colonial rule of law. So it was an alibi for colonial incursions up in Zululand and elsewhere. But here's how it worked. as delineated in some classic 1930s ethnographies. Witches were tried by isangoma, the healers, who could sniff out or smell a witch. Witches practiced the dark art of batagati, and witchcraft was unseen and unseeable. And it was pointless to try and deny being a witch, and it was equally pointless to rely on alibis or witnesses because you could never see it. It was invisible. You could only smell out the occult power within. So before the process of smelling out, the isangoma locked themselves in a hut, then burst out in a frenzy to find the people of the kraal arranged in a line or half circle. Chanting with a low voice, he would ask spirits to help get in touch with the right person. So there would be a lineup of people, he would channel, and they would be chanting. The isangoma would become excited and frenzied, dance towards the people, affecting to examine them by means of his olfactory sense. And then he'd touch the guilty one. Now, what could be more clearly parallel than inadvertently than the dog lineup that the early dog masters had set up? So there were clearly parallels between these two processes. This has been pointed out by early anthropologists, Hammond, Tuke, and others. And so when people were smelled out, it also might be that they were confessing to other things, to feelings of jealousy or resentment, or to feelings of evil within for completely other crimes. There could have been a terrible anthropological misunderstanding. So it might be for evil within themselves rather than any action they had taken. Prior to this time, colonial Western crime solving was intensely visual. You looked for visible clues and was also oral and auditory. You interrogated witnesses. But now there was this new agent of detection. And forensic science met at the confluence of this far older understanding of evil itself. Evil was unseen, evil was unheard, evil could only be smelled. So the police were happy. They closed a lot of cases in those early years. But the confessions might well have been extracted by a totally different understanding of being smelled out. Equally, and there were a few cases of this, some believed that the complete inverse, the opposite, that the dogs themselves were bewitched or actually working as witches' familiars. And so they were the bringers of evil rather than the solvers of crime. Okay, but all that said, one of the things that gives me some confidence in the veracity and the truthfulness of the police reports is that the constables were not afraid to talk of failure. So, I don't think there was a large-scale cover-up or an orchestrated conspiracy. In fact, several grumpy constables noted in different cases, widely separated by geography, how bad a dog called Milan was at his job. While at the same time, separated by hundreds of miles and unable to look at each other's reports, the constables commented positively on the abilities of dogs like Trewin and Sawa. They were particularly impressed by this dog called Sawa. I've got a picture of Sawa. He was a Doberman Pinscher, and Sawa was a legend who died at age 9 years and 8 days in Da'ar. Only one buried in the Da'ar police station. Possibly the only reason to visit Da'ar. Perhaps I shall. Died in 1926 by special permission of the Commissioner of Police nationally. And he was not a promising puppy. He was small, nervous, and awkward. But this little dog thrived on training. And this brings us to Sawa and the Ninevites. Now, a little background. When the South African police first began to train these dogs for scent, it was the time of the gangs on the Rand. It was the time of the troubles in Joburg. The Ninevites gang was the most powerful of the early colonial resistance movements, or the most dangerous criminal gang. Depends what kind of historian you are. So they've been seen as peddling a particular kind of Africa First resistance rhetoric, which makes them perhaps you can see it as an early decolonial resistance group, but they were also a feared and dangerous gang working up on among mine workers up on the reef. They were very active from 1900 to 1920. So when the dogs started up with the SAP, the Ninevite outrages were at their worst. They were started by a guy called Nongoloza, who was a charismatic Zulu migrant worker who built this quasi-military band of outlaws, wielding his troops together with a simple but potent ideology of banditry as anti-colonial resistance. And they have a very long legacy because they were the initial roots of the Numbers Gang. So, the Numbers Gangs in Cape Town now, under one of their leaders is a guy called Johnny Mongrel. So it's really funny how one can't escape dogs in our archival record. When finally one of the Ninevites was captured, he appeared in court, and in a speech from the dock, the Ninevite was called upon to plead, and he said to the judge, and I'm quoting, "My lord, what can we do now? The white men has trained dogs to become witches, and they have smelt us out." The judge then asked formally, "Does that amount to a plea of guilty?" "Not guilty, my lord," was the prompt reply. But the archive records that the judge then smiled. So Sawa also once famously followed a spoor that was 132 hours old. 1925, he was already an old dog. He tracked a stock thief to almost 100 miles in the Karoo, and he found him and the stock. Finally, Sawa even caught a fellow canine suspect for foul play. 3 ducks went missing in Pretoria in July 1920. Sawa traced them to a neighboring yard and pointed out the canine suspect, which is the only case of animal stock theft I've ever come across. Sawa's testimony was supported by a fellow police dog called Natalin, and the embarrassed owner of the canine criminal agreed to pay for the ducks, even the one that was still alive, but just, the record shows, very bedraggled. Of course, not all dogs were Sawas, but there is a remarkable rate of successful tracking or false alerts. We've got to walk a fine line here. So what was going on here? It's pretty clear that the ancient canine ability at sniffing may be augmented by a much more recently evolved trait, the desire to please a human. Remember, dogs were domesticated about roughly 10,000 years ago, and they've worked pretty closely with us then. They were the first animal to be domesticated in various places around the world, unlike the other animals. Certainly recent studies show that drug-sniffing dogs is quite interesting in Chicago. In 2007, said that in stop and search cases, only 44% of cases when the dog alerted actually found drugs. In stops involving Hispanics, the dog's success rate dropped to a mere 27%. So the dogs were identifying a lot more Hispanics without drugs incorrectly as having drugs. The problem is not their noses, but what they know. And there's a neurologist who's been working on this problem at the University of California, Davis, and it's all about microsignals that the handler is giving the dogs. And there's a Columbia University psychology professor as well who's experimented on dogs versus wolves. It's really amazing what you can get funding for in academia. But her tests are between dogs and wolves, and they find, it's quite interesting, they find that if there are no humans in the room, the dogs and the wolves do equally well at solving puzzles. But the minute you put a human in the room, not even a handler, just a random human, the dog does incredibly badly because it keeps looking to the human to solve the problem. They're looking for clues from us. And the wolves are fine, they just carry on solving the problems. So this is all very important in understanding what was going on. The dogs were watching the humans closely, and moreover, they were relying on humans to help solve problems. But here's the thing, and this is really the important thing. This phenomenon was understood in South Africa in 1920. It was understood by the cops themselves in 1920. So in 1918, the police commissioner downwards all understood the Clever Hans effect. Do you all know about Clever Hans? I know my sister doesn't. It was, no, it's fine, the others do. It was this famous horse called Hans, Clever Hans, that had this handler, and the crowd would shout out mathematical problems, and then the horse would stamp its foot to give the answer, because this horse was excellent at maths. But of course, it was the handler. It was just watching when the handler went, and then, not on purpose, the handler thought the dog could add, the horse could genuinely add. So that's what we call the Clever Hans effect. And it was understood by the South African cops 2 decades into the last century. They knew it. They knew the observer status. So I think that's very important. This was why, as was again discussed at length in 1918 and 1928 and in 1950, they had several commissions into what was going on in the dog unit. And they made 2 provisions that I think were very important. The one is that 2 dogs always had to work together, so it would kind of not rely on the testimony of one dog. And the second thing was that the dog handler and the detective working the case were never allowed to communicate with each other. So the dog handler had to go in blind. He was not allowed to know that this guy was sort of suspected, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, I think it's this oak. None of that was allowed. They had to work completely separately to prevent the Clever Hans effect already 100 years ago in South Africa. So, and then they had to submit 2 different reports to their immediate superiors to avoid this Clever Hounds effect. I see what I did there. So there was a general admittance in February 1918 from the very top that things had actually, in the first few years of having the dog unit, they admitted they had taken the dog's testimony too seriously and that things had gone too far. I quote from the commissioner, "Too much appears to have been expected from the dogs. They can only be considered an adjunct for the staff. It must be obvious that it's for the human brain to reason and discriminate between the innocent and the criminal. The dog just brings its sense of smell." And look, in the first years, I think this is something we must acknowledge. In the first 6 years, there were definitely arrests that should not have happened. They were solely on the evidence of the dogs. And they're not just arrests. You'll remember the guy who was sentenced to 7 years hard labor. That was not unusual in the first heady years of the dog unit. But we're only looking at about 6 years. After that, the police force itself, from within, shook itself out and realized something was going on. It was also featured in the South African press. The public was kind of aware of it too. The Commissioner of Police said, "No person should be deprived of liberty if the only reason is that they've been pointed out by one of our police dogs." The 1930 Commission of Inquiry summed it up again, reiterated that the training measures and the keeping the separate spheres of the detection process separate had to still happen. But the public had really bought into the idea of the police detective dog. The white public was enthusiastic. I've read several hundred requests from farmers and farmers' unions asking for dogs to be stationed in the outlying areas, predominantly for the crime of stock theft. But those early years, the dogs were solving a host of crimes. There were 2 rapes, at least, in the first year alone, that the dogs were able to find the perpetrator, and the victim was able to corroborate that. There was one terrible, terrible case of a baby that had been abandoned by its mother and died, and the dog was able to find the mother from the smell of the baby. And that was very, very heartbreaking. But there were others. There was arson, a lot of stock theft, armed robbery. There was even a train robbery that the dogs were able to get involved in. So while all this heady success is happening, there's constant questions from within the police force, challenges from the press, challenges top down, but also bottom up against the overuse of dogs. What I wish to emphasize to you is the self-reflexivity, the self-awareness that the cops themselves had of problems inherent to the dog. The judges, by the way, were absolutely clear that dogs couldn't give evidence. And also, the dogs, and this is very, very interesting if we consider what happened later, the judges were absolutely clear that police dogs could never hurt a hair on a suspect's head. They could not touch them. There was a guy who blatantly did the crime, Jan Mentor. He's a cheese thief, which is a weird niche, but he was a great thief of cheese. And when he was brought to book, I can only imagine he was really delightfully smelly, as cheeses should be. When he was brought to book, the dog got overexcited and bit him. And he sued the Minister of Justice, and he won. And he won a hefty, hefty payout. So that's very important. But all this carried on. Ooh, I see we're running out of time, so I'll skip a little bit ahead. The other thing that was happening with the dog unit was how it shifted in public perception. In the early years, no one really wants to become, it was very unclear what a dog handler would be, and it was extremely low prestige. But by the mid-1920s even, it was a high prestige job. There are many, many cases of people being turned away from this job, and you actually had to be quite better educated and a better specimen to become a dog handler than to become a regular cop by that stage. And the other thing was, BLACKWOOD, the dog breeding and training facility, became a national point of pride. By 1947, which immediately you'll all know was the year of the royal visit from the UK, one of the things the slightly befuddled royals were shown with pride was South Africa's dog training unit. The royals were shown, they were shown the dogs. Oh, it's very nice. It's a dog, yes. But they were taken on a complete tour of the unit. Let me show you. There they are, seeing the unit, because it was a South African point of pride. And while we might smile at that, it is worth noting that by 1950, South Africa was training the best police detection dogs in the world. 1950, we were top. And I don't say this with native pride, I say it because it's true. People are coming from all over the world. Britain, the London Met were learning from us. People were coming from Palestine, India, there were people from Pakistan. They were coming and training with us. America was obsessed with us. We were giving them ideas. And they sent cops here as well to train with us. And then we also exported our dogs globally. Up in Kenya, it's all coming from South Africa, BLACKWOOD. Up to about 1950, we were at the top of our game. We were globally, I think, the evidence is there to suggest we were the most important police detecting dogs in the world. And our science was way ahead of the other countries. But then things changed. And this was because of a change in the nature of the South African state. There was an ontological, a basic fundamental shift in the nature of the state. And this meant a change in policing itself under the increasingly heavy hand of the apartheid regime. Up until the 1960s, as I've outlined to you, dogs' noses were the thing. That's all they were. They were just about smelling, about detection. Never allowed to touch a suspect. And they were all about up on the mines and the rural areas. That's what dogs were used for. But of course, in 1961, just after South Africa became a republic, everything changed. The South African police went on a study tour of Europe. They sent Lieutenant Colonel Brink and Warrant Officer Killian, who were sent to Europe to learn about crowd control and dogs. And this was to shift the focus of the canine usage to the urban areas. They wanted a different kind of dog, a different kind of dog handler for a very different purpose. They wanted patrol dogs, defense dogs, attack dogs for urban areas and crowd control. So from 1962, these new dogs were attached in the flying squads in the urban centers in Joburg, Cape Town, and Durban. And these dogs were German Shepherd dogs that we bought from Germany. They were a new technology. They were a force multiplier, but with the emphasis on force. And they were focused on a new kind of gang too. Forget the Ninevites. The first target for these dogs were actually the white gangs, the ducktails in Joburg, but also the African gangs, the Tutsis. And then it shifted again, almost immediately, to political crowd control, as resistance to apartheid escalated. And the dogs were everywhere. In 1963, when they recaptured the ANC underground allies, later to lead to the Rivonia trial, it took 15 security branch men and one dog. A year after the innovation, there were only 164 old-fashioned scent detection tracker dogs, but there are already 234 attack dogs, patrol dogs. Over the next few years, the tracker dogs were used in 3,000 cases. The patrol dogs were used in 13,000 cases. 5,000 of those suspects in those cases were taken down by the dogs. Complete shift, a fundamental shift in what's going on here. It was a new kind of policing. It needed a new kind of handler, a new kind of training, and at its heart, it needed a new kind of dog. And a point that comes out of the archives very strongly is this shift, this change in the nature of the dog. But I think, and perhaps I'll just make a historiographical point, that what we have here, if we look at a critical and sensitive history of animals, we have to understand that there's no such thing as a dog. When we talk of dogs, we are talking about dogs as historical moments. Dogs that perhaps even more than other animals because they're so closely linked and shaped by us. There's no such thing as an ontological dog. There are only historical moments when dogs take certain shapes within the social fabric and also biologically and by training. So there's nature, nurture, and also how the social fabric perceives them. And this changes. Nothing is set like the mosquito and the amber in Jurassic Park. Everything shifts over time. So the dogs have now undergone an ontological shift. And to understand that history is to take the dog seriously, to look not only at the humans in apartheid policing, but to see what was happening a lot closer to the ground. So, apartheid's dogs were not inevitable. I think one of the key points I'm trying to make is that it didn't have to be this way. It was not inevitable. And this is, I think, perhaps the only point of having historians around. The useful thing about having people like me on the payroll is that we can point out that it wasn't always so. That is our one superpower. We can show you that the present was not inevitable. And by pointing out that it was not always so, that it has changed before, by God, it can change again. It can change again. And that's the importance of history. It is only by understanding the past that we defamiliarize the present and thus open the door for us to change it further. And that's the kind of quiet activism that we, people who prefer archives and tweed jackets, we prefer that kind of activism, but we think it's useful. So what is clear is that there's a large meta-narrative, a large overwhelming story of oppressive policing, and the role of the state has overshadowed the smaller stories of the intimate relationships between humans and dogs and the visceral reality of their powers. We started the talk with the vicious running dogs of the apartheid state. But because of that looming story, we have forgotten, and we must now remember, the 50 years between 1911 and 1961, in which dogs were used only for their noses and not their teeth. And the shadow of what came much later, the looming telos of the iron fist of apartheid, obscures the achievements of the men and dogs of Kwaggaspoort, a generation before it all went wrong. That story, that telos, also blunts the contemporaneous doubt, the doubt felt by the people on the ground, the friability, the fragility, the experimentation and the self-reflexivity of the early days of detection by smell. There were certainly successes, although these should be questioned, it can't simply be dismissed. So what is lost if we accept only what we remember in the very recent past, the terrifying, slavering apartheid dog, is how Dogmaster's Kuiper's heart beat faster when he thought of a good dog's nose. What is lost is how Sauer tracked a stock theft 99 miles in the Karoo and found him What is lost is understanding the intimate triad of human, dog keeper, and his 2 dogs. What is lost is the understanding they reached. What is lost is knowing actually how it worked. What is lost is also knowing how Sawa found the bedraggled duck. But in the shift from nose to teeth, so much was lost. And it's quite a good illustration of how it worked. And I hope you'll forgive me by ending really, of course, with a personal digression. I want to go back to the very beginning of the talk when I faced a choice between choosing Zenith, the dog of size and swagger, born attack dog, and Rio, the awkward but joyous dog who was curious about the world. And it was uncanny for me how it paralleled the history I was writing, how it paralleled the transition between the Sours and the apartheid dogs. And I had to choose between teeth and nose as well. And unlike the South African Police Force of 1961, I chose nose. I chose Rio. You know, I want to see where smell will lead us. And so I've decided that instead of doing defensive training or attack training with Rio, which was on the cards, I'm doing search and rescue with Rio, where she's learning to track. And what I used in the early years, in the early months together, I actually used Dog Master Coper's original notes on what to do with in the first few months with your puppy. So I'm using a training manual of 100 years ago to get her going, but now we have started proper search and rescue tracking lessons. And it has been my choice to choose Rio instead of apartheid's dogs. But it's an act of faith, really, just as it was in the early years of the South African Police Force, and it might even be an act of hope. With Rio, just as my deployed over time, how their role has shifted. It asks questions about the mutable, the changeable role of dogs in forensic detection, and discusses contemporaneous understandings and also terrible misunderstandings of what a dog can do. It thereby explores the tension between the idea of the dog as merely an instrument of scent and the dog as a sentient individual. So I follow where the dog's nose leads humans forensically, but also politically in the long 20th century. And in doing that, I'll be looking at history from a lot closer to the ground than usual. But of course, the political is also the personal. And I wrote this paper at what I think was, well, during possibly the worst year I've experienced. 2016 was really quite something. If you speak to any academic who lived through that, people were unsettled, they were disconcerted, they were anxious. The universities no longer seemed to be the safe space they had been for intellectual discussion, for debate, even robust debate. Things were changing, academics were. It was uncanny, a strange space for us. And also, to make it even more personal, my beloved Rhodesian Ridgeback Mojo had given birth to 11 puppies, which was my experience of motherhood. Although my sister says that I must stop saying that. She's had an actual human baby. She gets very angry if I refer to that as my experience of motherhood. But it was. I was rearing these 11 puppies in my bedroom with me. We were co-mothering, Mojo and I. She would wake up at 2 a.m., she'd deal with it. At 3 a.m., they'd start screaming again. She'd look at me like, Sandra, it's your turn. So it really, for me, it was an inundation. It was intense. I didn't sleep for 3 months. And I don't know how to, perhaps my sound man will address this issue. Is this better? Perhaps if I speak awkwardly thusly. Is that better? Okay. Perhaps shall I hold it? Okay. How's this? I'll just hold it, it's fine. So yeah, a huge apology for being late. I did get into my car and leave Stellenbosch at 6:30 this morning. So it has been quite, I do not wish to be a prima donna, but it was quite something. But it is a great, great pleasure to be here. I love summer school. I get far more out of it than you do. No, really. It is a rare treat to have an audience who wishes to be there. It is very special for an academic to have people who pay good cash dollar money and give up their time to come listen to our research. And I loved the course I gave a few years ago on the history. It was called The World the Horses Made, the Global Forces Equine Input. And it went down very, very well. On the evaluation forms, people were very kind, except for one guy who said there was far too much about horses in it. So, alas, there will be animals in this talk, and, leave now if that wasn't what you were hoping for. But it is... I'm very excited to share this research because you're the first people I'm springing it on. And I don't really know why it is, because I finished the research about a year ago. And for a complicated set of reasons, I felt incredibly uncomfortable about actually releasing this in the cold, shark-filled waters of academe. So what I would like from you is to be as critical as possible today and try to pinpoint any glaring errors and omissions, as well as perhaps just giving me really candid feedback, because it is time for me to bite the bullet and allow this little runt to go to boarding school and live in the wider world. But when I tell you the story, you will see perhaps why I have been sitting on it. And that is because I'm a grizzled, hard-bitten historian who only does objective, detached facts. And I wasn't able to do this time, and you'll see why. You'll see why. So I'm feeling, I'm sort of coming out the closet here as being not so detached. And it's a very uncomfortable place to be. This is a strange liminal border area where feral historians roam. And I hope you'll just bear with me and just give me feedback. Be honest. Okay. So in 2000, and also I won't be deviating too much from the script because I want to give it as a paper. Then you see how it is. I won't just extemporize or do back of an envelope talk. I want to give you the paper. Okay. So it's a little bit like when Bob Dylan went electric. A lot of you will feel betrayed by this, but I have to do it. So we go to 2012. On a tour of his rural dominions, our president, Jacob Zuma, in dispensing his annual Christmas gifts and wisdom, warned his people that loving a dog was merely mimicking white people and showed that one suffered from a lack of humanity, especially if one walked one's dog or took them to a vet. Indeed, he declared it a rejection of African traditions and values. The internet erupted. Social media was inundated with photos of black men and their dogs. Especially, of course, the Trump card, Nelson Mandela with a Rhodesian Ridgeback. All my friends posted that. President Zuma was very surprised at this outburst. When you think of what he gets away with, why were we going nuts about this? So his spin doctors went into damage control mode. They explained that President Zuma had been trying to decolonize the African mind. So, what was really happening here? What was going on here? There is, I think, and I wonder if you'll agree, there is a deep ambivalence about dogs in South Africa historically. There's a strangeness in the relationship between dogs and humans, and between humans and humans over dogs. What I'm currently working on is exploring the history of that strangeness, and particularly through the lens of the police dog. To understand this ambivalence, the police dogs were creatures poised between citizenry and state, between technology and sentience, between being a living, breathing creature that thinks for itself, between agency, operating on its own 2 feet or 4 feet, and training, between those 2 points. And also, I'll show you the police dog was poised between good and evil, and always between nose and teeth. So using archival sources, ethnographic material, my project is to track the long history of dogs in South Africa, particularly in law enforcement. And it includes the lives of a few dogs. You'll learn about dogs called Bosco, Milan, Maxim, Flash, Killer, and Sour, particularly Sour, to explore how dogs have been very different. Oh, let's try. I have a terrible feeling this is going to pull down my skirt in an awkward fashion. In which case, could someone signal me from the crowd? sit, I've cried.
Can I introduce you?
Oh, please, thank you.
Good morning again. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Sandra Swart. Some of you may remember a few years ago, just 3 or 4 years ago, she gave a course, a timely course on horses in war. I remember it being totally upsetting. We are very pleased that she is back. I came across Professor Swart reading an article that she had written about the history of
Oh, so you're the one.
I'm the one. I'm the guilty person, and I thought this is what we need to have. Now, she's given me a terribly modest CV, but I want to awfully much, except that she has achieved something very, what should I say? It's just absolutely incredible that she did this. She's a professor of history at Stellenbosch University, and she simultaneously completed an MSc in environmental change and a DPhil in modern history Oxford. She recently completed a degree as president of the Southern African Historical Society. She's interested in social and environmental paradigms, focusing on the interaction of humans and other animals. Her most recent book is Riding High, Horses, Humans, and History in South Africa. Please welcome Professor Swart.
I just want to apologize from the heart for being a little late. It is incredibly unlike me.